Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, again, Merry Christmas. Good to be with you. At our last house, we were very fortunate to have a Christmas tree farm less than 10 minutes from where we lived. And as our kids were growing up, we would go and cut down our own tree every year. We had to search all over the lot, of course, for just the perfect tree. It was really the perfect Christmas tradition. But the last year we lived there was less than so. Instead of a pristine landscape with white snow kind of covering the fields of Christmas trees, it was maybe a little bit more like today, except a little colder. So it was a field of half-frozen brown mud. And of course, as sometimes happens, our kids couldn't agree on a tree. Our daughter found one she liked that she would not budge on. Our son was convinced it would be the worst Christmas tree ever. It did have a unique looking top, I'll give him that. But it also happened to be the cheapest tree on the lot. We were at an impasse, 2 kids, 2 opinions. There appeared to be no hope of resolution, and as it happens, appeals to reason seemed to have failed. The joy of the outing was quickly dissipating. So I took my son aside and explained that the tree his sister wanted was $5 cheaper. And if he agreed to the cheaper tree, I was prepared to offer him a cut of the savings. $1. He looked back at me and held up 2 fingers. $2 per piece isn't so bad. Christmas is a time when we celebrate God's Son coming into the world. Jesus is a fulfillment of what the prophet Isaiah foretold as the Prince of Peace. Peace is something most of us yearn for, both within us and around us. So often in the midst of our busy traditions and plans, we miss that peace. There's not the peace we would hope for when it comes to relationships between brothers and sisters in a tree lot, or as we gather over meals, or as we encounter neighbors or strangers in stores or in online venues where differences of opinion seem to be front and center. Of course, this year we're aware of the lack of peace in places like Ukraine and the Middle East. This might be what comes to mind when we hear that phrase, peace on earth. But perhaps for you or others you know, the desire for peace might be much more personal. There may be a lack of peace in our own hearts and minds as we face personal adversity, disappointments, grief, or health concerns. This inner peace is another dimension we seek in this season of light and hope. It's important to remember that the birth of Jesus didn't come at some crowning moment in history, some perfect time in the past. It took place in a time and part of the world that was filled with unease. Throughout biblical history, Israel was located at the crossroads of a variety of competing empires. Every time some new power was on the rise, they looked to occupy Israel on their way to expand their territory and defeat their enemies. Israel was weak and caught in the middle of all of this. In the time of Mary and Joseph, Israel was controlled by the Roman Empire, which was powerful and oppressive. Roman authorities kept order with brutal force. If you were born in that land, disruption and occupation was the norm. You lived with it, you expected it. And so although it was a major disturbance, the decree by Emperor Augustus that everyone should be registered and travel to their hometowns would have been exasperating, but predictable under authoritarian rule. The purpose of the census was to collect taxes, and a forced return to your home of origin to facilitate the count was a particular burden. It was about a 9-day trip for Mary and Joseph to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem in her final weeks of pregnancy. You can imagine the stress and uncertainty that accompanied that journey. And yet it was at this very difficult time for Mary and Joseph and really all of Israel that God entered our human story in Jesus. Within the very nature of the Christmas story and the life of Jesus, we find a symbol and a model for peace in the midst of disruption and struggle. The Prince of Peace that Isaiah foresaw can be translated Prince of Shalom. That was the Hebrew word. It's a word that we've explored in past weeks here at All Saints. Shalom is a state of being that has an inner dimension to it, but it also speaks about a peace and a state of well-being in relationships, communities, and nations. It's where healing and renewed life is experienced and shared by all. It's the vision that God had for all of us from the very beginning, and which has proven difficult for us to experience because of the broken ways of humanity. It's beautiful to talk about, but how do we experience that? It's one thing to celebrate with the shepherds and treasure all of the hopes and promises with Mary on a night like this. But what if we could experience the warmth, joy, and peace that Christmas promises beyond this night? I want to suggest a couple of ways we might do that. The first is to simply hold on to the warmth and gentle grace that underlies the Christmas story. There's a certain universal delight and a sense of peace and joy in the story of Christmas itself as we think about the way that Jesus is born despite everything Mary and Joseph go through. There's a sense of wonder in the story of Magi arriving from the east to find the child, and the shepherds encountering an angel in the fields, pointing them to a miracle in their midst. We are drawn to experiences of wonder and amazement ourselves, and we await a miracle in God's coming and everything that we confront today. Back at that time, because of the disruption of the census, there was no room for Mary and Joseph, and they had to gather in a stable which would have been a cave kept for animals adjacent to a first-century home, as the story suggests. Jesus, Son of God, was not placed in a palace throne room, but in a manger, a feeding trough made for animals. And so the manger is a symbol of humility and vulnerability. For the Son of God to enter our world in this way is a sign of hope. It's a symbol that God comes to us in a spirit of peace and grace rather than power and judgment. Not all who imagine God even today begin with that spirit of peace and grace, and it can make all the difference. If we know that God approaches us with love, compassion, and humility rather than with a condemning spirit, it has the power to transform our own spirit and perhaps how we choose to relate to others. One way to remember the message of peace and hope that comes to us on Christmas is to recall the symbol of the manger throughout the year. If you like visual reminders, you're welcome to take the bulletin home and use that as a point of reflection in the coming year. Keep your manger scene up a little longer in the coming weeks. Or go back and revisit the service in July if you need a little Christmas hope midsummer. When we receive the grace that God offers, one of the places where our own sense of inner peace meets peace between people is when we extend that same grace that Jesus comes to us with. In the Christian tradition, we sometimes do that through the practice of forgiveness, which is a real expression of grace, something that Jesus taught us in the course of his own life. Jesus invites us into a way of life in which we care about our neighbor, in which we seek to maintain right relationships with others based in love, respect, and by extending human dignity to all people. That doesn't mean we'll always agree or be friends. It means we care for the well-being of others. And when we do this for others, we do it for God. We live out the vision God had from the very beginning for us. And so we think about the world today. We see wars between nations. We see conflict between individuals, groups, and ideas. The values of our faith certainly inform how we might respond to these challenges more directly. But faith also teaches us that the greatest impact often begins within ourselves. As much as grace and forgiveness is fundamental to Christian faith, I was reminded of its power a few weeks ago when I saw an article about the benefits of forgiveness. Psychologist Robert Enright is a pioneer in the field of forgiveness science, in case you didn't know that existed. And he's a professor of educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's been studying forgiveness for about 40 years and is co-founder of the nonprofit International Forgiveness Institute. They go all over the world to places of conflict to talk to people about this. He's found plenty of evidence that the act of forgiveness has psychological benefits, including reducing anger, anxiety, and depression. Forgiveness also has a positive impact on our health, including lower blood pressure, better sleep, lower levels of stress-induced inflammation, and a stronger immune system. Another expert, Professor Lauren Toussaint from Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, has also devoted a lot of time to studying the impact of forgiveness. You can find a link to some of his resources by going to our spiritual wellness tab on the page under the Be Well tab on our website. Forgiveness at its core is actually more about what happens inside of our own heart than what we ever say to another person. It doesn't mean we need to become friends or condone something wrong. Reconciliation and justice are separate pathways that can be related and impacted, but are not assumed. Forgiveness is about finding a semblance of peace again within ourselves, getting our own heart right. It involves letting go of anger and resentment, developing some degree of empathy. You come to see the humanity in the other and offer some degree of goodness to the other as best you can, even if it's just a step toward that. Nurturing this kind of grace in our own hearts is not simple or easy, and it can take time, but it's a new perspective that can ultimately transform our hearts, our minds, and even our bodies, and the way we approach our relationships and the world. In a world that can be filled with conflict and judgment toward those unlike us that wrong us, I wonder what might change if everyone began first with this spirit of grace. It's not simple. I was driving in traffic yesterday. I get it. And yet, in another way, it can be so simple. Ultimately, a spirit of grace and joy helps us move beyond our own singular vision. And I think that's what Christmas offers us. The hope and joy of Christmas has the capacity to draw us out of our own experience and see something greater. It drew the shepherds out of their experience in the fields. It drew the Magi from their place to see this thing they had discerned from their observations in the sky. Whether our own experience of life right now is really joyful or whether we struggle at times, the hope and joy of this new child and the story of Jesus calls us to look beyond ourselves. It causes us to take note of the good happening around us, to see some good in the world. At the very minimum, I think that's what we love about Christmas. It's an event, an experience outside of ourselves that brings us together and makes us pause and reflect and delight in a moment of beauty and hope. And I think we all need that. But it can be an experience and a message that we carry with us throughout the year, just like the shepherds left that night with renewed joy and hope. We carry that hope with us when we remember that God begins a new story alongside us that is filled with love, grace, and peace above all. That's a story that we can never lose. It's one we can never stop telling or seeking to live out. And so that's why we gather on this evening and why we continue to tell the story. All over the world, today and tonight, in the smallest gatherings to the largest. From simple spaces to grand cathedrals, Christians are coming together in the simple hope of the Christ child, the light of the world that offers peace, grace, and a path forward for new life, not just for us, but for all people and all the world. May you rest in that peace tonight. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.